Hello and welcome to the Complete Physio podcast. We're here for another episode, and today we're joined by women's health physiotherapist Sophie Else. Sophie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Me.
Excellent. So we were chatting about what we're going to talk about before the podcast, and what we're going to discuss today is incontinence.
Incontinence is the involuntary leakage of urine. And it's something that you can't control. There's a number of different types of incontinence, and it is so common in women. We know that 1 in 3 women suffer from incontinence.
Wow.
So it's crazy to think that no one talks about it. And I know that from experience, from patient experience. People don't. They don't talk to loved ones, friends, family, relatives.
GPs even?
Yeah, and a lot of people find it hard to go and see a doctor about this. And the first time they speak about it is often in the room with myself, and they've had it for years with their partner doesn't know. So incontinence is the leakage of urine, involuntary leakage, I suppose. And there's different types. You may have heard of stress incontinence.
Do you want to talk through the different types? That would be really useful.
Yeah. Okay. So if we start with stress incontinence, that's the leaking of urine if you cough, laugh, sneeze, maybe if you're jumping or doing some impact, maybe if you're lifting shopping or lifting your baby, or could be lifting weights at the gym. For everybody, it's really different. And just because you might feel it's at a higher level for you, it doesn't mean it's less important. You know, if it affects your life, it affects your life. You shouldn't have to put up with it.
Absolutely.
Another type is urge urinary incontinence. So this is when you get a really strong desire to go for a wee and you can't stop it and you leak urine. Some people find this is when they go on the way to the toilet. Some people find it happens when they hear the tap running, or we were talking about it earlier. Some people find it when they put the key in the door.
Yeah.
Putting in the key in the door. That's quite common, isn't it? That's really, really common as well. And again, even if it doesn't happen often, if it happens, you shouldn't have to put up with it. And I hear so many people say, oh, it's part of being a woman, it's part of having a child or going through menopause. It is really common, but you shouldn't have to just put up with it or keep quiet about it. I think it's really important that you say we talk about it, we make it a conversation that you feel comfortable having with friends, with family, with anybody really.
And so it's the main 2 types that we've got there. Any others?
So then you can also group it into what we call mixed incontinence, which is when you have a bit of both as well. Some people find they also get some leaking of urine after they've been for a wee. So as they stand up, they're leaking urine. And that's more about how you're emptying your bladder and other things causing that. But they're the main areas that you'd find that you're having leaking of urine as well.
And what groups of women does it affect? Because I'm a man. Does it generally affect women postpartum? Does it generally affect women as you get older? Yeah. What are the groups that it generally does affect? But I assume it can affect anyone.
It's anybody, yeah. So actually, I guess if we go through it, you can have women of all ages being affected by incontinence, because it can be caused by weakness in your muscles, but also kind of overactivity of your muscles. So we do get younger women who haven't had children who also leak urine. Maybe when they're doing running or impact, often it's high level athletes that are doing impact exercise.
I see lots hear lots of high level. So I worked at British Athletics, and there was definitely a group of female athletes that suffered with this. Again, didn't really openly talk about it. But also CrossFit athletes, I know,
CrossFit's really common, and that's something that's coming up more and more now.
Not just CrossFit, as in strength training.
That kind of thing. But I think it's about on average 33% of people who are high level athletes that do impact type work or lifting have some sort of urinary incontinence, and about 30 to 40% of them aren't aware of what to do or how to improve it, and no one really knows. So that's a population that may not have even had children. So that's one area. Another area, you're right, is people who have had a baby, and that can be a vaginal delivery or it can be a cesarean. It's also about the weight of carrying the baby through pregnancy. So it's not just having a vaginal delivery. You know, if you've had a cesarean, you've had weight through your pelvic floor, that can cause incontinence, and that's about 1 in 3. And then postmenopausal is another really big chunk of women. So as hormones change, you might get a little bit more laxity in ligaments. I think it's around 50% of women postmenopausal will have experience of urinary incontinence.
And that's the stress or the
It's both. It's either really, and it's more just, and it doesn't mean those people will be stuck with it for life, but that's the percentage of people that are affected by incontinence. But there's so much we can do to help with it. But it just shows that it's not just pregnant ladies or ladies that have had a baby. You may never have children in your life, but you could still be affected by this. And it's often not just to do with damage or weakness to your pelvic floor. It can also be to do with maybe overactivity of your pelvic floor as well.
Which we'll definitely come on to, because that's a bit of a myth, I think, isn't it, around pelvic floor?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to sit here and work out why this isn't talked about and why it isn't in the sort of general, if you say I've got a knee problem, you might tell somebody about it. So is it embarrassment? Is it the fact that they think nobody else suffers from it? Or is it the fact that they think this is normal and you get this, or the fact they think they can't do anything about it?
I think it's all of them, sadly. I think I get a lot of women come through the door and they say they didn't realise you could do something about it. I actually had a lady the other day who, she must be about 8 years post-menopause, and she's had urinary incontinence since she went through menopause, that urgency incontinence on the way to the toilet. And she said she was listening to Women's Hour the other day and someone was talking about it and said that they went and got help. So she went to come and see me, and within 3 months her symptoms have improved significantly. And
you can do an awful lot for these things.
You can, but in her mind it was, oh well, she didn't know there was something out there. Then other people think you can't fix it. Yeah. And some people just think it's part of being a woman,
and getting a bit older, or
after having a baby.
Yeah.
And so many, there's such a narrative of like, oh, you just put up with it. You should never have to put up with it. Or people brush it aside. And again, I have patients come through the door and they say, oh, it's not that bad, I can put up with it. And I just think it's really sad that that's how people feel, or that's the narrative at the moment.
And I think you're a women's health physio. This is what you do in the NHS and private practice. So I think there is also an issue around the help that is often offered to people at the GP level. And that's no offence to GPs. They have a very difficult job and a short period of time, and they're not specialists in this area. And I know that the access to specialists like yourself on the NHS is very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, private practice slightly different, but you've got to pay for it. So do you think that's part of the issue, is that we're not talking about it, but actually people aren't getting the help or seeing the right people that they should?
Yeah, and I don't think it's as available as it should or could be. I do think and hope things are changing. So I know that there's lots of guidelines coming out that GPs will be aware of in the next few months, I think, actually, about how to manage these types of symptoms. The first line treatment being physio is very highly recommended. Hopefully recruitment is improving in the NHS and private, and awareness as well. Same with guidelines on perinatal, postnatal care. There's a big NHS 5-year plan that will affect private and NHS work of this kind of physio, that it's becoming more talked about, like you say, raising awareness. So hopefully it is more spoken about. People are happy to go and talk to someone, and they know that there is help out there as well.
And where is that help? So have you got any advice in terms of where people can look online to get good information, other than obviously the Complete Physio podcast?
Yeah, of course. Apart from that, I mean, there is the POGP website, which is quite a nice website. It's one that we follow a lot in our profession. That has quite a lot of information. NHS websites tend to have good information there. And I know, like you've said, we've got some blogs, obviously, so you can look there. Yeah. In general, if you type in what you think you have, there should be good information out there on the internet. In terms of just knowing where to start looking, it is a bit of a minefield, but I think the main thing is really just talking to friends and family, because you'll find most people have something going on experience going on, or something that you have. And actually a lot of people say it's just having someone to listen to them and reassure them that it is common. And I think if you can have the confidence to start that conversation, you'll find most people come back to you and say, oh, I have the same experience. I had a lady yesterday actually come in, and she said she was talking to her antenatal group about what was going on, and 9 out of 10 of them piped up, and they're like, oh, yeah,
somebody's just got to open that conversation,
and once
don't
someone they all spoke about it, and they didn't realise there was such thing as physio and how they could get help. But now they're all passing it on to their other friends and things. So I think if you can, try and have that confidence to talk to someone about it, and that will open so many doors to you and so many other people as well.
And I can imagine a lot of people may not immediately go to their partner, although, because let's be honest, blokes aren't, or man or woman is not going to just suddenly embrace that as a conversation if they've got no experience of it or have got no knowledge of it. So I'm assuming, you know, female friends are probably a good place to start. And as you say, there are sort of help groups, aren't there, and forums out there on Facebook and that. But I think you've got to be careful what information you're giving, because I think there's a lot of myths around it. So do you want to just go into, people always, we naturally now will go into the sort of pelvic floor and the pelvic floor muscles, which obviously as a physio you spend a lot of time talking about. But I think, and we'll go into it, I think there's a lot of misinformation, or at least if I need a wee, okay, and this is the only analogy I can give you. I've just come on the tube and I was in a rush and I was desperate for a wee. Okay, I have been, don't worry. And my natural thing to do is to try and hold it in. And then I sit there and go, well, that is just not helping. In fact, if I just try and relax, I felt that I was less desperate, and obviously try not to think about it and that sort of thing. So talk to us about, we'll come back to the story, but talk to us about what the pelvic floor does and how that's involved in incontinence. Let's talk about that first of all.
Okay, so the pelvic floor is a sling of muscles. It runs from your tailbone to the front bone, the pubic bone. And it's like any other muscle. It needs to be able to switch on and it needs to be able to relax. So it needs to be able to move through range. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, and they think you have to be super, super strong to stop any leaking or any symptoms. But actually, if it's always stuck on and really strong, it may not be able to support you in the way it needs to. So that pelvic floor, like I said, is like any other muscle. We need to keep it strong, but we need to keep it moving as well. And what it does is it supports your pelvic organs in place. So it supports your bladder, your bowel, and for a woman, your uterus as well. It holds it up a bit like a hammock. And it also controls your bladder, your bowel function, and your sexual function as well. So it's got a few different roles there. And I think people also think this pelvic floor is super duper strong and you have to squeeze as hard as you can, like you say. But it's more about having good control and good activation.
As in, you've got the ability to voluntarily switch it on and switch it off.
Yeah. But some people almost go so hard with it that they overdo it. And I think actually it's just more about that good control of the on and the good control of the off of the muscle.
Because if we go back to the one of the subgroups that get it, which is CrossFit athletes and strength training, these guys are solid. They've got a 12-pack stomach. Like, do they actually have a weak pelvic floor?
No, so often for these people, their pelvic floor is probably a bit switched on, like I said. It's a bit stuck.
Tight.
It's a bit tight almost. It might be called high tone, or there's tension in their pelvic floor. And if that muscle is stuck, it can't switch on to stop you leaking urine, and it can't switch off properly to help you empty your bladder. So that's where you then get the leaking. You know, it's a bit like when your bladder's then bouncing, there's nothing to give with it as it's bouncing. So that's why they leak urine. So if you told them to go and strengthen their pelvic floor, they're just winding it up and getting it worse and worse. What we want them to do is learn to relax it. So they've got more movement in that pelvic floor, more bounce, more give, and then they're less likely to leak as they then do their activity and their exercise as well.
So there's a massive misinformation out there.
Yes.
Fundamentally, you go on Instagram, somebody talks about incontinence, they talk about strengthening your pelvic floor.
Yeah.
That's crap.
Yeah.
That's actually fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, and for some people that's right, but it's not one size fits all, and it's not as simple as like, here's one exercise and we're all fixed. And that's where I wish there was more availability for people to see a specialist pelvic health physio, you know, available in the NHS or private, or the understanding they should go and see someone, because what happens for A doesn't happen for B. You know, it's so different. Some people do need to strengthen. Some people need to work on their breathing. Some people need to work on their relaxation. Some people, it's their posture and the way they run that loads their pelvic floor differently.
Because we always think about it like, you know, the urge, you don't want to let urine out, but then there is also a skill to properly emptying, which is then going to feed into when you then need to go. Otherwise you end up going all the time, and you get, is it an irritable bladder?
Irritable bladder, and I suppose like people also think that if they relax their pelvic floor, everything falls out, urine and, you know, prolapse and all of that. It's not the case.
Hang on, let's go back to that, because that is absolutely the case. When I was on the tube, I felt that if I relaxed, I'd wee myself.
No. And in a way, if you...
I didn't.
No. Good, I'm glad.
But I'm sure it could happen.
Yeah. And people worry that if they've got this tension in their pelvic floor, if they start to relax it, everything's gonna fall out and they're gonna be weak. Whereas actually, often those people who have that tension are super duper strong. They're too strong almost. And as soon as we let it move, the strength is still there. It's just that movement is better as well.
It's really interesting. So immediately that makes me want to go on to the next question, which is, how do you know if you've got incontinence, whether you're somebody that needs to relax and get that natural movement, or are you somebody that does need to strengthen?
So that's where it would be best to seek professional advice.
There's no real way of having an algorithm and working it out. You've got to internally assess them, I take it. Yeah.
I mean, from what someone told us, we would probably be able to say, I think it's this or I think it's that. But to be honest, until you properly examine someone and do an internal examination, you don't truly know. And it frustrates me to hear people go and see pelvic health physio and they say they didn't get examined, but they've been diagnosed. And it's frustrating because we may be 99% sure, but I think that's really important to do that check. And I think we can give people general advice, but you wouldn't go and see a physio for your knee and then they only look at your ankle. It's really important that it's properly looked at and checked, because there's more to it than just it's a bit switched on or it's too weak. There's so many other factors we can assess. And it's only through that
proper assessment are you actually going to then be able to help to get the right management, because you need to know that. So I think that's a really key message, is that, and a bit like you said there, women's health physio is not a protected title. It's not about seeing a physio. Physios don't do everything. You need to see a specialist like yourself, because you need to be properly trained and have the experience of doing internal examinations to assess the pelvic floor. Do you want to just talk through a little bit about what it would be like if you came in to see a women's health physio and what sort of information you're trying to gain?
Yeah. So I guess people come in and we look at you as a whole. We look at your whole body. I still would look at how you breathe and how you move and everything. We ask lots of questions about your lifestyle, your symptoms, your bladder, your bowel. Your bowel can also really affect your bladder and link to your incontinence. So there's quite in-depth information and questions we'd be asking as well around sexual function. As I said, I'd then be looking at how you're moving, how you're breathing, how you're loading through your body, because that again will influence your pelvic floor. Then we'd look at your abdominals, how you're activating that as well. And finally, if you felt comfortable, having just said it would be useful to do an examination, if someone didn't feel comfortable, there's still lots of other things we can do. But ideally, if they were happy to, we would then do an internal vaginal examination. Again, at any point, if they felt uncomfortable, we'd stop. It doesn't use any equipment or anything like that, just a gloved finger, but we can really assess that muscle internally. There are other ways of us assessing the muscle, but again, it takes that training and that knowledge to do it. We could potentially use some scanning, or we can just look from the outside. But I think it can guide us a lot if we are able to do that in a session.
Just thinking aloud, but if I was a CrossFitter and I was getting some incontinence during a certain activity, would you then need to do the assessment in that position, like in a standing position instead of lying down?
Yeah, so I would examine most of my patients standing up,
right?
Because realistically, not many get their symptoms lying down.
No,
very few, but not many. And I would want to challenge them to the point where they're potentially having symptoms. So again, I'd have to explain that in the session, but that's where again it becomes more specific to you than just giving generic information. I get a lot of women lifting during our sessions, or bending, or doing things which causes their leaking, to try and mimic it, to work out why. At what point is the pelvic floor not functioning as we want it to? And then that's where we can start to build and work on their treatment. So we might get some weights in the session. We might get them, like I said, doing movements they do to pick up their children, or even if it's gardening, what positions are they in? And most people initially find it a bit odd that you're asking them to do that. But actually, if you're being really specific to their symptoms, you're much more likely to improve and resolve them if you can do it in the way that they're having their symptoms.
And I can imagine there's a lot of anxiety around it. And I don't mean people that are anxious get this. I mean, it builds anxiety, as in, because if you are fearful of, leaking, there's a lot of fear around that and anxiety, which probably then perpetuates the problem.
Yeah. And then people stop doing what they want to do. They stop going out as much. They don't leave the house. And then in a way, being active is a really good way to naturally strengthen up your pelvic floor as well. And I think, like you said, it builds into everything, that tension, that worry. And it's not a nice thing to leak urine. And
No.
I can see why people feel it, but it also doesn't help when it's then not talked about as well.
Yeah.
So many other factors that influence it. And I think if we can provide this environment where we examine and check everything, almost reassure them that they're not going crazy as well. I think sometimes people have been checked in the past lying down, oh, you're fine, no problems. Whereas actually, if you can recreate their difficulty, that gives them some reassurance that they're not going crazy and they're not making it up as well. So I think people are quite grateful for that as well.
I can imagine. The other thing I was just thinking there, if I Googled pelvic floor strength or something like that, I'm sure I would get people selling me stuff. Yeah. As in pelvic floor trainers, these devices that you put inside and you try and squeeze. But already what you're telling me is that could be the absolute opposite of what you need, and therefore make your problems worse.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, they're great. Yep. But again, I would say once you've been told that you need to strengthen up in a certain way and you feel like the only way you're going to be compliant is by playing games and following a machine, brilliant. But for a lot of people, they don't have the time to lie down for half an hour and use these devices. Yeah. Sometimes people use them and they end up using other muscles. So they end up strengthening through their bottom muscles and it stimulates the machine. And you're right, there are people that actually need to relax their pelvic floor. So for the right group, they are fab and they're really good devices and they're really good ways to engage someone and get that muscle strengthening, but they're not for everybody. And again, I think this is where people are trying to put women's health physio into a tiny pot, and actually it's so much more complex than people think it is.
And let's be honest, a GP is not going to be able to give you this information, so they're going to be limited with what they can do. And this is where hopefully women's health physio, like for example in Australia, becomes a lot more accessible, a lot more talked about, a lot more seen as a subspecialty, which I think is going that way, isn't it? It's certainly developed a lot.
I mean, it's something that it's just time. Sometimes all patients need is someone to listen to them. So we have longer than the GP, and actually you sit and listen to someone for 45 minutes, an hour, and they properly tell you about their symptoms, they probably feel listened to, and they're much more likely to engage in things. And I think in that session, we just give someone the time of day, we give them the time to explain stuff, and we can help them so much more just because of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking just a couple of examples of if you had a patient where they really did need to strengthen, for want of a better term, I think we've agreed that, or I'm assuming they also then need to be able to control it and relax it. What sort of treatment options do you have as a women's health physio that you share with your patients?
So a big part of that, of course, is then doing your pelvic floor exercises. So in our session, we'd work out how strong someone is, how good they are with their control, their coordination. Is it a timing issue? Is it a strength issue? Is it when they load their body that they're not as good at doing it? Is it that they're not very good at breathing as they're doing it? So there's lots of factors of just the pelvic floor exercises, and we try and build it into their day-to-day activities to make it more functional. And then with that, a big part of it is looking at their posture and how they're loading their pelvic floor, how they're exercising as well, because we know
because like if you think about, sorry to interrupt, if you think about a runner or you think about a CrossFitter, with the bouncing and the load, I can't imagine they need any more strength. They probably need to learn when they're running how to relax their pelvic floor. Would that be right?
Or even simple things like just having soft knees when you land a jump, or that forward-leaning posture, or slightly tweaking how they're running to change where the force is going through the pelvic floor can really make a difference as to how their muscles are functioning. And again, with runners, you might find that they're very shallow with their breathing. So if we get more deep breathing, we get more movement of the pelvic floor.
Certainly all connected. I mean, it's very connected, isn't it?
Yeah.
Involuntary.
Yeah.
It's very connected.
Or, with the people doing weights, if they're breathing out on their effort rather than bracing and straining, that will bring up the diaphragm, bring up the pelvic floor and support them as well. So that can help. So a lot of kind of building into their day-to-day and function and exercises. A big thing as well is actually, like I said, going through bowel management, because that can really influence the bladder, because if you're constipated, it's pushing on the bladder and can worsen symptoms. And the same with fluid intake and things like that. So there's loads of lifestyle things that we go through that.
It sounds very multifactorial.
Yeah.
That it's not just, as you said, it's not one treatment fits all. In fact, it sounds like the opposite, which it often is in many of the things we see as physios. But you're just giving advice, you're making it specific to the context of the problem that they've got. And yes, it probably does involve some home exercises or relaxation and that sort of thing. I think that, you know, I don't see these patients because I'm not a specialist in it, but I think one of the key messages is, like, if you've got a problem, you've got to talk to somebody. But talk to somebody because you can actually improve it. You don't have to live with, I can only imagine, which is a very worrying, unsociable issue. That you think probably, well, I've got it when I'm 45, it's probably going to be terrible when I'm 65. I'm going to have to, you know, surely lots of women are wearing pads and as it's quite
and there's lots of ads out there, which I think it's changing now, but used to just be like, here's a pad to solve it, as opposed to actually that's just putting a plaster on it really and patching it up. You know, there's so much more to it than just popping a pad in there to stop that leaking. I think there was a study actually that showed that, so if you leak urine when you cough or sneeze, if you squeeze on your pelvic floor muscles before you do it, that can stop it happening. There's a study that showed with women, if they did that in 2 weeks, 97% reported it was pretty much resolved in a case where they didn't have too many issues. So it just shows something really simple can make the world of difference. And I think a lot of patients say that when they come in, they take away the tiny things and they come back and they feel that it's changed their life significantly. And it's not groundbreaking, it's not lots of stuff, but it's just like starting that conversation, feeling comfortable to talk about it, and there'll always be something we can help with. Always something.
You must have a very satisfying job. You know, once you get a patient in here, there's a lot of information that you can get across, which, let's be honest, they probably don't know or have misinterpreted or misunderstood.
And it's very rewarding when you get that as well. And I mean, that's why I love what I do. That's often why I run late, because I feel like I have so much, so much to talk to people about, so much to tell them. And it frustrates me that it's not available to people, or people don't realise it's available. So it's probably out there. It's just they don't know where to look or who to talk to. And obviously
waiting lists have gone up, particularly since COVID. And, you know, imagine waiting a year for something where it's frustrating, isn't it? But hopefully that will change, as you say. So thank you very much, Sophie.
No, that's all right.
Hopefully, even if that just means that one person talks about incontinence, I think that was very, very much worth doing. And I think, as we said, the key message is talk about it. Don't be afraid to talk about it, but I can imagine that's really hard in some cases. And try and get specialist advice if you can. Not everybody's going to be able to go private. If they can, come and see Sophie and get the right information. And certainly my experience of working with you is that these people aren't coming in and seeing you 20 times, but they gain so much information from that first consultation. So thank you very much.
No, that's right. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.